Facebook page. My name is Jenica Liberator. I use she and them pronouns, and I'm the program coordinator for education and outreach at the LGBTQ Center in South. And tonight we are being joined by Dr. Carrie Foote, who works with the HIV Modernization movement. And she's here to present to us HIV criminalization, what's so bad about laws that criminalize people living with HIV. And there's going to be a few points for questions during it. So if you're joining us on Zoom and you have any questions, just drop them in the chat. And if you're joining us on the Facebook live stream, just drop them in the chat underneath the live stream. And I hand it over to Carrie.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for inviting me. I'm really excited to share about the HIV modernization movement and what we're doing here in Indiana, basically to end the criminalization of people living with HIV. So my name is Carrie Foote. I use she, her, and hers pronouns. I'm an associate professor here at sociology at IUPUI. I also chair the HIV Modernization Movement Indiana, which I'll explain to you what that is and what we do. And I'm also a woman living with HIV. I tested HIV positive in 1988, and you can learn a little bit more about my story if you click on that link in your own time. So if you have any questions as we go along, just, feel free to put any of that in the chat. No, I didn't want that. Sorry about that. I didn't mean to do that. All right, so who are we? The HIV Modernization Movement was formed in 2016. Our mission is basically pretty straightforward. We're a diverse group of individuals who seek to modernize Indiana's criminal HIV laws. They're deeply outdated, lacking in scientific merit. These harmful laws criminalize and stigmatize Hoosiers living with HIV and are extremely counterproductive to ending the HIV epidemic in Indiana. We are a grassroots movement network. We're not a nonprofit. We have no budget, no funding. We're just a diverse group of people that we were formed by people living with HIV and allies in the field who supported and saw the need to modernize the laws. And we've just grown to be this statewide network that is working to modernize several laws in the state of Indiana. So you can learn about us through our brochure, which is at the top of the page. There's a link. And then we do have a website, and we also are on Facebook, so you can like our Facebook page. So first things first, I always like to just make sure we're all on the same page on just basic HIV 101, because to really assess these laws and to understand why we need to modernize them, we need to, just first look at the science and say, do they reflect current science of what we know today about HIV, how to prevent it, how to treat it? So treatment, we know today that with treatment, people living with HIV can have a near normal life expectancy. HIV is a very chronic, manageable disease these days. Transmission, we know exactly how it's transmitted. We've actually known how it's transmitted since the early 90s. It's transmitted only through penetrative sex, syringe sharing, mother-to-child transmission, and then blood transfusion prior to FDA screening of the blood supply. We know for 100% that saliva, urine, and tears do not transmit HIV. We also know that blood outside the body does not transmit HIV. And it's very simple. HIV is a very delicate virus. As soon as it's exposed to the air, it dies. So if I cut myself and I'm bleeding, people don't have to get afraid and get scared. They're not going to get HIV that way. It's basically a virus that is not easily transmitted. We also know with all these kind of pictures here, again, life expectancy, we can live long, well lives, just like the general population. We can have babies that are HIV free. We know that the blood supply is safe. So if you need a blood transfusion or you need medicines that are made from plasma, you don't have to worry about getting HIV because the FDA and the government protects the blood supply from all infectious disease. We also know that today we can actually give life. We can be organ donors to other people living with HIV, both deceased organ donors and we can be living organ donors. And then we also know there's many ways to prevent HIV, right? We have PrEP, 1 pill a day. So people who don't have HIV can take a pill, they can have condomless sex and not worry about getting HIV. And then we also know that not only is treatment keeping us alive and well, but treatment is 100% prevention when it comes to sexual relations. So U equals U, the fact that when we're treated and our viral load becomes undetectable, we basically can't transmit HIV, right? So we can have condomless sex and not worry about fear or stigma while we're having sex with our partners, that we know we can prevent HIV with treatment. So this is awesome, right? We've come a long way since I've been diagnosed in 1988. We didn't have all this. So we're doing incredible. We have the tools to end the epidemic. But one thing has continued from the early years in the epidemic, and that's HIV criminalization. So we have these incredibly outdated laws that were enacted in the early years of the epidemic in the 1980s, in the 1990s. And that's what we're trying to do here, is modernize these. So first we need to know, what is HIV criminalization? It's simply the inappropriate arrest or criminal prosecution of people living with HIV, including for alleged non-disclosure of their HIV status, potential or perceived HIV exposure, or non-intentional HIV transmission. Many cases involve acts that pose zero risk of HIV transmission, such as spitting, biting, scratching, or sex using proven prevention methods. In other words, our HIV status is used as a standalone basis to single out people living with HIV for unique and discriminatory treatment by the criminal legal justice system. A few states, including Indiana, also criminalizes people living with viral hepatitis. We see criminalization occur under HIV-specific laws that only apply to people with HIV, but we also see it under general criminal laws, where charges or punishments are initiated or heightened solely because of a person's HIV status. And then we see, and this is particularly true in Indiana, that these laws are connected to public health policies designed to inform people about the law, and in some cases serve as extensions of the criminal law, whereby people working in the public health field, the HIV arena, are actually facilitating, almost sometimes unknowingly, the potential prosecution of their clients and their patients. And this example here of this image, this is a young man from Iowa who basically had a one-time sex encounter with his partner, where he had anal sex with a condom, he had oral sex without a condom, he was undetectable at a time, and he faced a 25-year prison sentence for non-disclosure to his partner in Iowa. So if you just think about that, here's a guy who couldn't even have passed on HIV. Number one, we know that undetectable is untransmittable in any kind of sexual relation. And two, even at the time, he's showing that, well, I'm even going to go further and I'm going to use a condom for anal sex to be, however more protective. 25 years, you just wrap your brain around that. We don't even give 25 years sometimes, for intentional murder of a human being. And here he's getting that kind of harsh sentence for just not telling his partner he was HIV positive. So that's what we're talking about, HIV criminalization. When you look across the United States, you can just look at this map for a minute. I take a sip of water. It occurs all across the United States, and you'll see a whole bunch of colors here. And the colors are showing what's going on in each state. So you have kind of the grayish color, and in those states, those are states that have no HIV criminal laws, and they've never had anybody prosecuted in their state under their general criminal laws. So if you want to be in a state that's safe when you're HIV positive from the law, you could move to one of those states and you'll be okay. Although you don't really know that, because it can happen at any time, especially if there's no advocacy going on in that state. Then you have the gold, where there's 8 states that have sentence enhancement. So there's a general criminal law, and if you're HIV positive, you get sentence enhancement, which basically means that you get a worse punishment than if you didn't have HIV. Then there's 28 states in the dark red that have HIV specific criminal laws. And then we have states, 25 of them in the orange, that have prosecuted people under general criminal laws. And that would be something like bioterrorism laws, attempted assault on another person, all kinds of different things that people have been charged under. The little markers, the green and the yellow markers, the green ones are states that have either reformed or repealed And up in the corner, it's blocked on my screen, but in 2021, we had 5 more states join those 8 states. So Illinois, Missouri, Virginia, and Nevada have either repealed or reformed their laws. So we are making progress in the states in terms of modernization, but as you can see, a lot more work needs to be done. The yellow markers are states where if you get arrested for allegedly, and I always use the term allegedly because often they can't prove that you disclosed, you know, you're just accused of doing this. And then people often plea bargain to get out of potentially facing some really harsh sentences. In those yellow states, if you're charged and you're prosecuted for alleged non-disclosure, you get put on the sex offender list. So not only do you get a felony, which is going to wreak havoc on your life, but you're also going to be listed as a sex offender, which really makes life very difficult in those states. Fortunately, Indiana is not one of those. But as you can see with Indiana, we have every other color in our state. So we're prosecuting people under HIV specific laws. We're prosecuting people under general laws where there's sentence enhancement. And we've also prosecuted people living with HIV under just general laws that have nothing to do with disease status. So we're making progress, but there's a lot that needs to be done. This map also shows you there's absolutely zero consistency across the United States in terms of what people are doing in different states. So what's happening out there across the US? This is just a snapshot. We often see profound media stigmatization where when people often are charged under these laws, the news reporters and the journalists get hold of a story, and they publish these horribly stigmatizing and scientifically inaccurate headlines that then stay on the internet forever. Even if your charges are dropped, that article stays on the internet. Your HIV status is disclosed basically all to the public, and you can just read those. The charge is murder, the weapon AIDS, man charged with using spit as a deadly weapon. And just, you know, not only, I mean, gosh, you know, we're being portrayed as deadly weapons, but it's also telling the public, well, spit can transmit HIV when that's simply not true. HIV predator served time for a crime, but may be confined for life. So you can just kind of see just how horribly stigmatizing these headlines are. And then with sex offender registry, and for those of you who aren't familiar with being on the sex offender list and what happens, it does vary in different states in terms of when you are put on those. But Robert Suttle here in Louisiana, when he was charged for non-disclosure, you can see right there on his driver's license, it says sex offender. He's not a sex offender, you know, he's a man living with HIV, just trying to manage his life, you know, and he's accused of non-disclosure. And I believe he has to have that on his for a full 10 years before he can get it off. And then every time he moves to a different state, like he lives in New York now, and New York has Megan's Law that requires sex offenders coming from out of state to register, all this sort of thing. And they actually pass notices around that you see there in that picture in the neighborhoods that you live in, so people know that there's a sex offender in the neighborhood. And he's not a sex offender, he's a person living with HIV. And then we also see, again, as we saw with Nick Rhodes on the previous slide, these draconian sentences. So Michael Johnson, you know, and I just texted Michael because, you know, Michael's originally from Indiana. And I asked Michael, how old were you when you were charged? He was in college. I believe he was a sophomore or junior when he faced charges of non-disclosure in Missouri. He ended up getting 3 concurrent 30-year sentences. He said he was 22 years old when that happened. 20, I mean, to me, that's a child, 22 years old. And he was arrested and faced this horrible, again, if you think about it, and you think of people doing things like, you know, even crimes against children, which would make anyone, you know, be horrified, you know, a crime against a child. Those folks aren't even getting this kind of sentencing, but people living with HIV are. Fortunately, Indiana doesn't have that harsh sentencing, but several states across the US do. So you can read more about their stories. I put links in this slide to learn what happened to them. And, you know, with Michael Johnson, I'll just throw this out there. You know, he was charged in a rural part of of Missouri, outside of St. Louis, by a jury of his peers. Here you have this, beautiful, young, strong, Black gay man, is being charged of non-disclosure. Several of his partners were white. The jury was predominantly white, except for one person. There was a Black juror on there. The public defender that was assigned to him was so nervous about just defending her client when she walked in there that she actually said to the judge, "Your Honor, my client is guilty until proven innocent." And the judge actually had to correct her. "Don't you mean it's the other way around?" And that just shows how nervous she was. So you can see when you read the articles about just he was damned from the time he walked into that courtroom with a jury judge, with a jury trial. Doing really well now, really incredible young man. So Indiana, what does it look like here? We have about 6 laws that criminalize people living with HIV in different ways, and it's a mixture of criminal code and public health code. We have a law, and all of them are felony convictions, and once it's a felony, felonies just make life incredibly difficult. Felonies are harsh punishments, all felonies, even a felony 6, the lowest level. So the first law is criminalizing us if we don't disclose our HIV status prior to any kind of sexual act that could transmit HIV, or sharing syringes with somebody else while knowingly HIV positive and not telling them our HIV status. That particular law also criminalizes people living with hepatitis B, but no one in the state of Indiana living with hepatitis B has ever been charged under that law. It's only been people living with HIV who've fallen victims to this law. And then we have laws that make it a felony if you attempt to donate, sell, or transfer semen for artificial insemination or blood and plasma while HIV positive. So these scenarios would be, okay, there's that local plasma center on the corner and says, "Hey, donate your plasma, I'll give you $40. And I'm HIV positive, and if I know I'm HIV positive and I attempt to donate, I say, "Hey, I could use $40, I can face a felony crime." The other part here, the transfer of semen for artificial insemination, the scenario there where you could face a felony is if a man who's living with HIV decides to seek fertility care in the state of Indiana and wants to use like artificial insemination in vitro to have a baby. They can face a felony offense, even though it's perfectly safe for men with HIV to use fertility services, their sperm washing procedures, they can engage in IVF and all these sorts of things. The science is there, but they can face a felony conviction. And then the final laws that we have are very related. They're general criminal laws, battery and malicious mischief by body fluid when living with either HIV, tuberculosis, or hepatitis. So those laws have sentence enhancement. And so what that means is anyone in the state of Indiana can be charged under those crimes and face a crime. An example, there's a couple examples. It could be like you're getting into a physical fight and somebody spits in a very aggressive manner on someone else. That would be battery by bodily fluid. Malicious mischief is traditionally more seen like something, I always think of it like, you're a waitress in a restaurant and you got these horrible customers that are treating you awful. So you go and you spit in their food, you see it on sitcoms all the time. That would be like malicious mischief. So anyone can face criminal penalties for that. But for the general public without HIV, it's a misdemeanor crime, so a minor crime. But if you have any of those diseases, you face sentence enhancement, meaning it goes to a felony. Even though no fluids outside our body in any way, shape, or form under this law could possibly transmit HIV. So what's happening in Indiana? These are just some headlines from our state. Again, you can kind of look at them and see, just how stigmatizing they are, how scientifically inaccurate they are. They don't tell the story at all, really, of what happened, when the person was charged. It's just a headline. And the way they're written is as if these people intentionally were trying to harm someone else or harm another person. And then often they're misleading and they're just totally inaccurate. So like this one where it's HIV positive man charged after spreading it to multiple women. In that particular instance, this young man, he didn't transmit HIV to anybody. But that's how the journalists portrayed it. So again, kind of portraying it, and that individual now is seen as basically a demon. Oh, how could you actually do this? Man charged with HIV spitting in hospital staff's eyes. Again, sends the message to the general public that spit can transmit HIV. Doesn't tell anything about, what actually happened when this person was in the hospital of the nature. So these headlines are incredibly damaging, again, right here in Indiana, where people's, again, forever, you just can go on the internet and search HIV crime Indiana, and you'll get a whole host of headlines. And that's just incredibly damaging. No other disease would you see that, because we have HIPAA protections and all of that, but because in Indiana our disease status is built into the law and the criminal law is public information, it doesn't matter. We have no protections when it comes to protecting our health status when we get charged under these laws. So these are just some examples. I won't read these all, but when you get the handout later, you can look at them. Because a lot of times when people think of criminalization, they only think of, well, someone ended up in jail or someone ended up in prison. And they're thinking, well, the vast majority of people with HIV are not going to fall into these situations where they're charged. And that may be true, that it could end up being, of all the 12,000 people living with HIV in the state of Indiana, it may end up being that 150 or 200, which to me, that's an incredible high amount of people, out of 12,000, might actually face charges. But what people fail to know is that when you have a criminal law, it affects all of us living with HIV, as well as people not living with HIV, because it contributes to stigma and makes it just harder for people to get into care, get tested, when they do test positive for HIV, to come to terms with their HIV status. And then all other kinds of collateral damage can occur from these laws that have nothing to do with prison or jail time. So these quotes that I have on the next couple of pages kind of point out the other things that happen that a lot of folks just aren't thinking about, but are very real in the lives of people living with HIV. So I'll just read the first three on each page. The health department showed up at my mom's house, accusing me of non-disclosure for sex with men. I hadn't even told my mom I was gay or had HIV at the time. So here you have a health department person showing up, I've got a health directive for your child. Where are they? They've allegedly broken a law, and starts talking. And this poor young guy hasn't even talked to his mom about, I prefer to be with men, I had, or that he had HIV. So now he's outed. And that, fortunately didn't cause all kinds of damages with his family, but it could have. It could have. Young LGBTQ kids are kicked out of their house. All kinds of things could happen. I've had clients decide not to be tested when they learned of Indiana's HIV criminal laws. That's actually also quite common if you're already a member of an already criminalized group. So let's say you're a sex worker, right? And you're making a living off of, basically selling sex. And that's a crime in the state of Indiana. And then they say, well, you should really get tested for HIV once in a while. And you're like, but wait a minute, if I get tested for HIV and I'm positive, then I could also be criminalized for that. And then I face two criminalized statuses, HIV and being a sex worker. So like, you know what? I feel fine. I don't need to go in and get tested. When of course we want people to get tested. We want people to know their status. When I asked my patient why she attempted to donate plasma, she said she knew the plasma would be destroyed, but she needed the money for diapers for her baby. So, she didn't go in there to harm anybody. She needed the money. She was desperate. She wanted it for something else. So all kinds of different things. And on this one, this first one was a young man who was at a college, not here in Indianapolis, somewhere else in Indiana. I keep that kind of just to protect their identity. He received his diagnosis from a blood center. He was part of one of these routine blood drives on campus, and being the good citizen, I'll go donate blood. I received my diagnosis from a blood center. The doctor that gave me my diagnosis was particularly malicious in their delivery. As soon as I entered the room, they said, "You have HIV, which means you committed a felony by donating. And if you didn't know you were infected, you still broke the law by donating after engaging in risky behavior and then certifying to us that you weren't. You're lucky I didn't have the cops waiting here. So are you shooting up or are you sleeping with men?" Then they handed me an envelope with my lab results and told me to leave. I was a nervous wreck for days afterwards, worrying there was still a chance they might press charges. When the DIS showed up on my doorstep, I almost lost it. The DIS are disease intervention specialists who basically, try to stop the networks of disease transmission in the state of Indiana, but he doesn't know. He's newly diagnosed. He doesn't know who these people are. And can you imagine? You get this life-changing diagnosis and she tells him, you're lucky I didn't have the cops waiting here. Another one, I was going through opioid withdrawal and having an epileptic seizure. I went to an ER for help, and all I remember was being put in handcuffs and a bag placed over my head for allegedly spitting on the doctors. And all I keep thinking in this scenario was, here's somebody who went for help, who was clearly in distress. And rather than call in the psych team and say, let's help this person, they call the police, call the security guards, and he ends up in jail. My newly diagnosed client was in an abusive relationship and was afraid to disclose to her partner because she feared he would hurt her. The lady at the health department didn't care if she risked the abuse and insisted my client disclose because it was the law. So these are all just different scenarios of the harms also of these laws on a very real individual level that have nothing really to do with doing jail time or criminal time. So the harms are very widespread. So I'll take a pause here, drink some water. If anyone has any questions up to now, you can ask them.
We don't have any questions in the chat right now, but if there's people that are on Zoom, looks like Anthony has a question.
Yeah, Carrie, I want to ask, how long have you been pursuing the legal matters of having the laws changed?
In Indiana, 2016, we started.
Hi, Daddy. Hi, Paisley. Okay, it's a long time.
It's a long time, but a lot of people don't realize that changing laws is a long process. It's not something, it doesn't matter what the law is, it's going to take a while just because of the way the legislative process is. And I'll just give you an example.
Whoa!
Hey, Tony, can you put yourself back on mute? I love Paisley, but can you put yourself back on mute? So in Indiana, we're all familiar with the, what were they called? I'm not originally from Indiana, so I forget the name of these things. The Blue District, where you couldn't sell alcohol on Sundays. And then we eventually changed those laws. That took about 10 years from the time they started advocating to change those laws to actually allowing alcohol sales on Sunday. So you can think, it took them that long to do that. And here we are trying to change a crime, how long it will take, especially in Indiana, where we tend to criminalize a lot of things. Another one are for the kids in high school and wearing helmets so they don't get concussions. That was another one that took about 8 years to finally convince the legislator to say, it's kind of like seatbelts. Not everyone makes the best choices when putting on a seatbelt, but we know that seatbelts clearly save lives. We're not asking you to do something really difficult. And it was the same thing with high school sports, and things like that, and having kids wear helmets so they don't get these horrible concussions that damage them for life. And that also took 8 years. So it's a long process. And so when you're kind of working on changing these laws, you're kind of in it for the long haul. It's not something where you come in and say, okay, we're going to do this overnight. It's not going to be that way. It requires patience. It requires kind of looking at what are our little wins along the way, what are we doing? And that's hard. When I first got into doing this, it was kind of frustrating. Like, why aren't we moving faster and doing that? Okay, So moving on, and we'll have plenty of time if more questions come up. Understand why HIV criminalization is a problem. Hopefully by now you've seen a little bit of why it's a problem from some of those examples I've given there. And I just put Carrie up here, and this is a scenario. He's in Idaho, currently in an Idaho prison, HIV positive. The virus was undetectable. He used a condom. He did not transmit HIV to anyone. He will not be out of prison until 2038. He was arrested in 2008 and charged. You know, and so you just got to wonder, what are we doing here? You know, giving these incredibly harsh sentences for life, you know, for someone who's just trying to manage living with a health problem, you know, and no risk of HIV transmission. So why are these laws a problem? There's a whole host of reasons, and I won't go into great detail here. But number one, HIV criminal laws do not work as intended. We've looked at a whole host of research. The original intention when these laws were enacted was that they would actually prevent the transmission of HIV, that somehow the criminal law, by having a crime and legally compelling people to disclose their HIV status, making it a crime, to attempt to donate blood, that people wouldn't engage in those behaviors, and somehow that would protect people from HIV and would be good public health measures. But what we found looking at the studies is that not one of these laws actually do that, what they were intended to do. There's no support whatsoever for these laws. And what we do find is they actually do the opposite. They work against good public health by punishing those who learn their HIV status, creating mistrust of health providers, and working against successful prevention programs like partner notification and public health messages, emphasizing shared responsibility for safe sex. And just a classic example, you can have safe sex regardless of what anyone says to you at all. You don't even have to have a conversation. You don't have to talk. Each individual can decide what they may or may not want to do in a consensual sexual behavior, right? They can say, no, I don't want to have penetrative sex. Or they can say, no, I'm not doing that unless we use a condom. Or they can say, no, I'm not doing that unless, you know, you're undetectable, or I'm on PrEP. You don't even need to have a conversation to do these kinds of things, because everyone has a shared responsibility for making safer sex choices. So these laws actually work against those, because you can't be arrested unless you know your HIV status. So we kind of have a phrase and a slogan, take the test and risk arrest, because it's actually very real. If you know your HIV status, you could possibly be prosecuted under these laws. And a lot of people, what happens is they're in a relationship, and they're in a contentious relationship where there's conflict and there's anger, and then there's a breakup, and then one partner uses these laws against the other partner to retaliate against them because they're angry. Or we see sometimes abusive relationships where people will use these laws and say, well, if you leave me, I'm going to call the police and say you're not disclosing your HIV status. So someone who's potentially being abused stays in an abusive relationship. So all of these laws are really working against public health and what we're trying to do in terms of getting people tested, getting them into care, getting them on treatment, and that sort of thing. They also don't align with current HIV science. They reinforce inaccurate information about HIV. For example, they incorrectly suggest that HIV is easily transmitted. You know, most people think if you have sex once with a person with HIV, you're going to contract HIV, and that's just simply not true. Even if that person had a really high HIV viral load, and you engaged in the most riskiest sexual behavior that could transmit HIV. So let's say you're having anal intercourse and the insertive partner is HIV positive, the receptive partner is not. Let's say they have a very high viral load. There's still a good chance that that person's not going to contract HIV. Why? Because HIV is not easily transmitted. It also sends the message that HIV is a death sentence, right? When you give out a 30-year sentence to somebody, that's what we give for first-degree murder. So it's sending the message to the public that, you know, the reason they're doing that is because if you get HIV, you're going to die. And that's not That's not the case. It's a very chronic, manageable condition. And most people with HIV are probably not going to die from an HIV-related illness these days. They'll die from some other kind of older age thing, accidents or something else. So they also lead to unjust and extreme prosecutions as they punish behavior that neither caused or intended to cause any harm. And just one example here. This is from our battery by bodily fluid law, and this is the exact wording in the law. This is what it reads. A person who knowingly or intentionally in a rude, insolent, or angry manner places any bodily fluid or waste on another person commits battery, a Class B misdemeanor. It's a very minor crime. But the offense there becomes a level 6 felony, which for level 6, just to give you some context, you can get up to 2.5 years in prison, $10,000 fine. If the person knew or recklessly failed to know that the bodily fluid or waste was infected with hepatitis, tuberculosis, or HIV. So the problem, there's no intent to harm required. A criminal law against a person is first thing is what was the intent? What was going on in that person's head? Did they intend to harm another human being? That's not part of this law. There's nothing in here about intention. No harm is actually required in here. It's just basically you place it on somebody else. There could be absolutely zero harm in that situation. And then there's no transmission required here at all, that an actual harm occurred, and then extreme penalties. So it spreads misinformation about how HIV is transmitted. And another example, I'll just read to you, it's equivalent when you look at a felony 6 in Indiana. I looked at other crimes against people, and what are we giving a felony 6 out for when you have a crime against a person? So it's equivalent to battery by bodily fluid and serious bodily injury. So then I look up an Indiana code, well, what does serious bodily injury mean? And under Indiana code, it basically means injury that creates a substantial risk of death or that causes serious permanent disfigurement, unconsciousness, extreme pain, permanent or protracted loss of impairment of the function of a bodily member or organ, or loss of a fetus. And here you have a situation where there's no harm possible, and it's being treated the same as a crime that causes serious bodily injury. The other reasons they're problematic, they're rejected overall by the U.S. Department of Justice, numerous leading public health, medical, and legal experts. They're costly to the state. You know, a lot of people don't realize, you know, once you arrest somebody and you put them through the courts and they do jail time and they go to prison, even if they don't do that, they're going through the system. Someone is paying for that. And that's our tax dollars, you know, and it's a complete waste of money to be prosecuting on people under these outdated and antiquated laws. So they're costly. We could be using that money for something else in the state of Indiana. There's a disproportionate impact, right? So we have people living with HIV, but within our community, we have diversity, and we have all the hierarchies of, you know, just marginalized and oppressed groups. And when you look at who gets charged and who gets prosecuted under these laws, we see this disproportionate impact on disenfranchised communities of people living with HIV. So people of color, especially Black people, LGBTQ, people living in poverty, sex workers, those who use illicit drugs, and those who have unmet mental health needs. So, you know, the more vulnerable, more oppressed groups among us, groups that are more likely to be criminalized, like people of color, sex workers, those who use illicit drugs, face another layer of criminalization if they're HIV positive. And then it increases stigma and discrimination, thus worsening the existing social stigma of HIV, which experts agree is one of the biggest obstacles to ending the HIV epidemic. It's like if you go back to that first slide that I showed you, like where are we today with the science, and we have all these great things. We know how to prevent HIV. We know how to treat HIV. So, you know, why haven't we ended the HIV epidemic? Well, it's precisely this last bullet, because we haven't really addressed the social drivers of the disease, number one being stigma and discrimination. So when you look at this bar, and I apologize, it's a little bit blurry, but this is what we call the continuum of care in HIV. And the idea is, starting with the first red bar, is we want people to know their status. If they're positive, we want to link them to care and get them connected. to an HIV provider. Then we got to keep them in care, right? Because just because you show up at the doctor's office doesn't mean you're going to come back the next time. And then once we're in there, we want to prescribe you HIV medications. And then the goal is that you will become virally suppressed, first for your own health, so that you can live well and not get sick from HIV. And then secondarily, as a prevention measure to prevent passing on HIV to others, because it's treatment as prevention. But as you'll see, we're losing people. The bar gets shorter and shorter as we go along the continuum. And the reason for that is the blue bar before all the red bars, that we're not addressing all these social drivers of the epidemic: racism, poverty, homophobia, shame, violence, stigma, classism, homelessness. And that's where we fall, up at the top with the purple bar, the purple box. We're trying to address the social driver of stigma in the legal and policy environment, which are the unjust HIV criminalization laws. So really, reducing stigma is so key to ending the epidemic. And stigma takes a lot of shapes. It's internal, it's external, but there's nothing more stigmatizing than to have a criminal law that criminalizes you of something that you cannot change about yourself and a health status. That is stigmatizing and adding to basically keeping us from moving along the continuum. So that's where we are trying to modernize all these laws. So if anyone has more questions, I can take a sip of water before we transition to the last part about any of that.
Seeing any in the chat. Looks like you're good.
Okay. All right. So in the final stretch here, I'm going to talk about reform efforts and what folks can do to help. And there were a couple of videos. I'm not going to play the videos that you can kind of just look at this. This is a cool little campaign that the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation is doing to try to bring awareness across the United States to modernize these laws and get people to join the movement to end HIV. So HIV is not a crime, but in more than 30 states, people are being imprisoned due to their HIV status. Thanks to scientific advancements, HIV is no longer a death sentence. With the right medications, the risk of transmitting the virus from one person to another is zero. Despite this medical progress, people living with HIV are being charged and branded as criminals because of their status. When we look at legislative and policy solutions, there's lots of different things you can do when we go in and we try to change a law. And if you've never been involved in doing this, it can be very daunting and overwhelming. I am not trained as a lawyer, I'm a sociologist. I don't know anything about the law when I started this, the details of it. And I learned. And when we're trying to propose a legislative solution here, because it is a law, you can either repeal a law, just get rid of it altogether. Say, you know what, get rid of that. And that's a great solution, right? If there's an unjust criminal law, just get rid of it, repeal. The problem is when we repeal the HIV specific law, we've seen people be prosecuted under general criminal laws. And that happened in Texas. In Texas in 2000, I believe it was 14, they had HIV disclosure laws, very specific HIV criminal laws, and they repealed them. They're just get rid of these laws. And then what we saw were people were starting to be arrested under the general criminal law, like attempted homicide. And so the idea then was, you know what, maybe repeal is not the best solution. We know there shouldn't be a law that's linked to somebody's health status of any kind. But when you get rid of it, then it just leaves, any kind of prosecutor to go after anything and to kind of, use stigma and misinformation to prosecute people living with HIV. So the approach, and this is mostly the approach we're taking in Indiana, is modernization. We're kind of doing a mixture of repeal and modernization. And what modernize means is that you still have a law that may be disease specific. Ideally, we don't want it to be HIV specific, because that's singling out HIV as if somehow it's, something more alarming than other serious bloodborne diseases like hepatitis C, hepatitis B, both of those can have very serious consequences if left untreated, and there's no cure for them. But at the same time, we don't want to criminalize more diseases if they're not already criminalized. But the idea here is to cover only when someone's charged intent to harm, and that the law must reflect advances in science. So the idea is to ensure that any prosecution that ever occurs is based on alleged exposure to a communicable disease, including but not limited to HIV, requires all these different things. Right now, none of the laws do. Number one, that the defendant, person being charged, intended to harm another human being. Proof that the defendant engaged in a conduct that is scientifically shown to result in harm. Proof that the conduct of the accused in fact resulted in that intended harm. And then if all those three are true, and you can say, check your box, yes, they intended harm, yes, they engaged in the behavior that could have harmed, and yes, harm actually occurred, then what should be the punishment of that harm? So punishment that is proportional to the actual harm the defendant caused. And then to avoid stigmatizing language in the law, and all the laws should reflect the current science of HIV risk and transmission. So the whole idea here is a lot of folks, when they kind of learn about these laws and just because of stigma, treat people with HIV as actually, once you're positive, like you're trying to hurt other people, right? Like, why would you want to have sex ever again in your entire life? You're HIV positive, and if you do, you're intending to harm somebody. There's this assumption because of stigma that once you're positive, there's this fear and that sort of thing. In reality, when we look at people who might fall into this category of you intended to harm someone else, which means you wanted to pass on your HIV, you actually engaged in a behavior that did, and you really wanted to pass it on, we find, maybe a handful of cases since the beginning of the epidemic that actually fit this description here. And even in those particular cases, we find that the underlying issue is a larger mental health issue, and that individual will be better taken care of in the mental health system than the criminal justice system. So this is kind of what we're aiming for here in Indiana, is a modernized law, repealing some of our laws and then meshing them to create a modernized law so that when someone is accused of something the way they are now, then the prosecutors and the defense, they have a law that they must go to use. And the law is based on best criminal justice practices, as it should be. When you're taking away somebody's freedom, it shouldn't be easy to prosecute them. We value freedom in our country. And it should be difficult to prove all these things. So that's what we're trying to do. You could also decriminalize. And decriminalize, the easiest way to understand that is in like the context of marijuana, right? So you decriminalize possession, you decriminalize, go from a felony to a misdemeanor. Basically, you're removing penalties. So we could just leave all the laws as is, don't touch them, except say there's no felonies. The worst sentence is a Class A misdemeanor. And that would be an improvement, right? It would get that felony, the person wouldn't have a felony on their record, but that doesn't solve the problem, because these laws will still, send the false message that the person living with HIV is dangerous. We need to do something about it. It doesn't affect the science, but you could decriminalize. That's a way to go. And a lot of times it's like a mixture of all these things, and it varies by different states because we have different political contexts in different states. You could have prosecutorial discretion, and this is kind of happening in different parts of the country right now, where some of the national advocates are trying to educate the prosecutors because they don't know any better. They don't know how HIV is transmitted. They don't have basic HIV 101, and they're operating on false assumptions. But when they can educate them and say, these laws are really outdated. We know it takes time to change the laws, but until then, can you show some kind of discretion when these individuals are charged under these laws? So that can stop criminal prosecutions and reduce the harms of sentencing. They have those discretion, they can do that. But what we see sometimes is they try to make an example out of people living with HIV, and they say, we're going to give you the harshest sentence that I can possibly give you as a prosecutor, as if somehow they're sending to the public, don't do this because you're going to be punished very severely. And then there's restorative justice, which just assumes a harm has been done. It engages the alleged victim and, the process of what do we do here? How do we restore justice? And then there's litigation. You could challenge the Supreme Court of the state of Indiana constitutionally through the judicial branch instead of the legislative branch on some kind of civil right, disability right type of violation. So for example, we are people living with disabilities. When you test HIV positive, we're protected by the American with Disabilities Act. And just to use the spit law, spit doesn't transmit HIV, yet we are treated differently under the law. We'll face a felony as opposed to if we didn't have HIV, it would be a misdemeanor. That is a direct violation of the American with Disabilities Act. So we could challenge that at the level of the Supreme Court. Since we started, we've had 3 bills starting in 2019, 2020, and 2021. We've passed 2 of those, but they did not really, they didn't really change the criminal part of the code. But what they did do is they completely eliminated stigmatizing language in the entire Indiana code. So one example, our disclosure law, it used to be called duty to warn. So it said we have a duty to warn our sex partners. We have a duty to warn our injection drug using partners that we have HIV. The word warning is incredibly stigmatizing. So we just changed that word throughout the code to the word inform. So it carries less stigma. And we did that other ways. Carrier, we were referred to as, carriers of those dangerous diseases. So we changed carriers to person first language, that were people living with communicable disease. We changed the word dangerous to the word serious. And that was a big advancement. So between 2020 and 2021, we completely modernized the language in the Indiana code. And, the language we use to describe ourselves really does matter and make a difference. Language is powerful, it carries meaning, and is how we kind of construct the world around us. So when we destigmatize our language, we're also removing that, if you go back, the bar before the bar, that stigma barrier to getting more people tested and into care. And this is Representative Ed Clare. He's an angel. He's down in New Albany. And he's our legislative champion in that picture right there. And I like to show this picture because I was literally in tears when I saw all that green. All those greens are yeses, and there's 2 no's, the red. You just don't see that with HIV when you're passing a bill. There's a lot of people who usually are opposed, but because of his advocacy and his efforts to modernize, he was able to get his colleagues to see, we need modernization here and we need to change these sorts of things. And the one thing I like to throw out there is a lot of times people try to characterize this as, oh, it's a red issue or a blue issue. No, it's a health issue. Doesn't matter what party you are. We're talking about a public health issue. It's a bipartisan issue. Everyone, once you start to educate and talk to them, most people will start to see, you're kind of right. We need to modernize this and we can do better, with this epidemic in the state of Indiana. So how to help? Make sure you're registered to vote. That's number 1. If you're not, get out there and register, and then encourage others to register to vote, particularly people living with HIV. There's so many people living with HIV who are not registered to vote. A lot of people have been disenfranchised all their lives. They haven't been encouraged to say you have a voice, your voice matters. If you vote, talk to your legislators, it actually does make a difference. But if you're not registered to vote, your legislators don't care what you say at all, because you can't elect them into office. So register to vote, enact that power that we have here in the United States that, once you're 18, you can register. Follow our email listserv, share our HMN brochure, encourage people, especially people living with HIV or other, vulnerable groups, to get involved, people who are most vulnerable to contracting HIV, because it's our lives and our stories are really powerful. So when you get those who are most impacted involved, and they share their stories, it affects other people. You know, I'm a person living with HIV, but I didn't get involved in this movement until I heard my peers tell me like their stories of criminalization, their stories of their friends. And now I'm the same way. You know, it's like, well, that could happen to me. It actually could happen to anybody, less likely because I'm not a member of all those vulnerable groups in that sense. But stories are powerful. They're firsthand experiences of harm, of change, you know, of what we can do. Educate your legislators, especially in Indiana, our senators. And I'll just be brutally honest here. A lot of our senators need to go. I mean, we need more younger people, more people kind of representing really the population of Indiana. And our Senate body doesn't really represent the bulk of Indiana. And they're very hard to just kind of get through and educate. And a lot of them think they know everything and don't want to listen to experts, don't want to listen to science. So there's a lot of education, I think, that needs to occur with our senators, and just basic HIV 101. Just tell them, hey, you know, it's not a death sentence. Look at me, I'm alive, I'm doing well. Tell them about U equals U. U equals U is very stigma, destigmatizing. It eliminates stigma. When you tell people, not only does treatment keep us alive, but it actually prevents HIV. It's almost like a functional cure. It's not a cure, but you know, in a way, it's like, well, you can't pass it on. And it just, you know, a lot of times people, it takes a while to wrap their brains around that, but once they get it, they're like, hey, that's kind of cool. This is pretty neat. And then educate them for the need for modernization. But you can just start with basic HIV 101. During session, contact your legislators and urge them to vote yes on any active modernization bill. And then I always try to encourage people, and this was hard for me to learn, because especially because of my training in academia. You know, you ask me a question and you'll get an essay. You got to keep your message simple. A lot of times it's like, what's your elevator speech? You know, what are you going to tell your legislators? What are you going to tell people you're educating in the community? Keep it really simple. You don't need to get into the weeds on the issue. And it can be literally as simple as this message I put here. You know, you're having a conversation with somebody and you say, hey, you know, did you know we can end the HIV epidemic in Indiana? That actually we can have, you know, 0, you know, cases of people testing HIV positive, you know, 0 cases of people progressing to AIDS and, you know, getting sick from an HIV related illness, that this is actually possible. We have the science, we have the tools, but stigma remains a barrier to testing, treatment, and care. We can't really fulfill, you know, the possibilities of what we can do because of this, you know, problem called stigma. HIV criminal laws add to stigma. They have no public health benefit. Modernization legislation helps us achieve our shared goals of ending the HIV epidemic by removing stigma barriers in the law. You know, so it's also something, you know, you find out, you know, we do have a shared goal here. You know, you as a legislator, you may not like everybody in our community. That's okay. I'm not asking you to like everybody, right? You know, and we're a very diverse community, right? You know, we're people who've injected drugs, we're people who've engaged in sex work, we're people who have LGBTQ, you know, identities, Black and brown bodies. A lot of our legislators don't care about those groups of people. But what they do care about is that their family members don't get HIV, that their loved ones don't contract it. And that's the shared goal, that there's a shared public health goal that we want to end this epidemic because it's going to benefit everyone. So when you can kind of point that out to people and point out, you know, despite maybe differences, what's shared, then you can start to have dialogue and you can move forward. So this is our website, and if you want to get involved as an individual, you can just click there where the blue to join our email listserv. There's a little form. When you do that, I get you on our listserv. Here's a bunch of our advocates, again, with Representative Claire down at the State House. That's all I have. So these are just some of our sponsors who pay for our lobbyists: Lambda Legal, the Damien Center, Health Foundation of Greater Indianapolis, the Indiana Primary Healthcare Association, the Indiana HIV Advocacy Coalition, and then the Courting Group are our lobbyists. And I'm very thankful for them because we have no money. So they've provided their lobbyists in kind to work our bills. So that's been very helpful. So thank you. And if anyone has questions, be happy to answer.
Yeah, it looks like Paul Aarons is raising his hand.
Okay, let me stop sharing my screen so I can see everybody. Paul.
Hi, thank you. First of all, thanks for, those are such great slides and you gave such a compelling presentation. Thank you very much for that. And going back to the slide with the legislative policy solutions, let's, just for the sake of the discussion, say that the first three elements are established. And I recognize that that's would be very unusual, but let's just say that someone acquired HIV in those circumstances. What's a realistic proportionate punishment that legislators might accept?
So the answer to that is it depends on the state. So there's national advocate groups that kind of advise the states on, because we're not, like, I'm not an expert on legal stuff, right? So I need to say, okay, hey, Lambda Legal, who are legal experts, what should we be shooting for here? And on the national level, they advise a misdemeanor, which, and the reason for that, in a misdemeanor, I mean, you can also do a year in prison for a misdemeanor. I'm not in prison, in jail. There is that HIV is a very manageable chronic condition today. You can do everything else. It's much more manageable than something like even diabetes, you know, and that you can do everything else and anyone else. It's not taking anything from you. You can have children, you can have, you know, relationships, you can work, you can do all these sorts of things. So they argue for a misdemeanor, which me personally, I actually agree with, because felonies are like a life sentence. They ruin people's lives forever, regardless of if it's a felony 6. You may only do 2 years in jail, but that felony on your record is going to be a barrier for the rest of your life because of other policies like housing, where you can't live here if you've got a felony. Jobs, oh, we don't want to hire you, you've got a felony. So it creates a life barrier. Now the question in Indiana, I don't think we would ever get a misdemeanor across, ever, because we're such a criminalized state in terms of what we're giving out for crimes. I mean, we give crimes for very minor things in our state. We're giving felonies. So I know if we were to go in with a misdemeanor, I'm not even sure we would get a hearing in a committee. I think people might just laugh and say, are you know, or you go in and then it's a piece of negotiation. So let's say you're not going to get the misdemeanor, then a felony 6. And what I did in Indiana is I looked at other crimes. Like, I try to understand, well, what's our culture? How are we criminalizing different things and what would be comparable? And if it's supposed to be a crime against another person, which that would be our ideal law, would be a crime against another person, right? So I intentionally want to give you HIV, and I pick up a hypodermic needle that has blood in it that I know I just took from someone who has a very high, viral load, and I inject it into you intentionally, trying to give it to you. And then let's say I pass it and you test positive. There's a couple of challenges. One, there's no way to really prove that that's how you got the HIV, but let's say that happened. Okay, so you've done it all. And now you have to live with a untreated, uncurable disease, right? Which is very manageable, but it's also very stigmatizing. We haven't eliminated that. So now this person, we're trying to, and it's costly. We don't have socialized medicine in the United States. People have to pay for that, and often out of pocket, paying really expensive stuff. So there are all these other, even though it's very chronic and manageable, but the approach there is we need to fix the system. These are other systemic problems. But in Indiana, when we look at different crimes, just to kind of give an example here, like a felony 6 is 2.5 years in prison, which is what we're giving right now for non-disclosure. The worst, if HIV transmission occurs, which is only under our attempting to donate blood products. So let's say you attempted to donate blood products and somebody contracted HIV from the blood supply and they were somehow able to prove that it's because you did that. That one you can get a felony for. And then also a felony 3, which is 3 to 16 years in prison, which is impossible because the blood supply is safe. But the long story short is there's the goal is a misdemeanor, but in Indiana it'll probably end up being a felony for that, because I just don't see California, it's a misdemeanor. Some states have repealed and not even gone for the modernized law. Illinois, just north of us, repealed all their laws. In Indiana, we've had so many people prosecuted under the general criminal law along with these that our goal is to aim for a modernized law in our state as opposed to full repeal. And I don't think full repeal would ever get passed. There's too much, at least not anytime soon in this state.
Well, thank you for that answer. And if there's not another question, I have a follow-up, but I'll wait if somebody else has a question. Well, okay, maybe I'll ask my follow-up. So then, suppose instead of someone acquiring HIV, the other party, like that case you described, claims severe mental anguish or other consequences of, because of not having known and then finding out. Is there any place for a penalty there?
Well, and there's, right, let's say we had no criminal law. There's always civil law, and civil law is less harsh than criminal law because civil law is not taking away your freedom. It's like either restitution, giving somebody a fine, that sort of thing. There's also, now I'm forgetting it, and I had it on the restorative justice models, where, you can say, because the other problem is stigma, right? So a lot of times people feel harmed because of stigma, but HIV doesn't need to be stigmatized. This is a very manageable condition. We can live well lives, we're not dangerous. So stigma is adding to that mental, harm that person is feeling when they contract HIV. So if we were to eliminate the stigma, then the person wouldn't feel the harm. Because the idea would be, am I responsible for your distress over having a disease that you now, because often the distress comes from once you're positive, and this happens quite often when people test positive, no one's going to want me. No one's going to want to be with me. My life is over, even though it's a chronic manageable condition and you can do everything else that anyone else can do. And your HIV doesn't have to hold you back, but because of stigma, you have all those horrible feelings. So if the person feels angry, and upset about it, and that happens, people do, it's normal, we're human, right? I mean, that's going to happen. But then should someone else be punished with a crime for that? And these are the other thing I like to point out with folks is that these are, especially with sex or sharing syringes, these are consensual acts between adults. And we tend not to punish consensual acts between adults or other things that could cause someone distress. And I'll give you an example, contraceptive fraud. So I'm having sex with my male partner, and my male partner says to me, you're on the pill, right? And oh yeah, I'm on the pill. I'm not going to get pregnant, meaning actually I want to get pregnant because I want to be with this guy, or the guy has money and I'm like, okay, if I get pregnant, man, then he's going to have to give money, child support, all this kind of stuff. It could be very manipulative, and this kind of stuff happens. And then suddenly she gets pregnant and he's like, wait a minute, she lied to me. the courts aren't going to step in there. It's like, you were having consensual sex. We're not getting involved there. You know, that's between two adults, and things like that happen. And they may feel really bad about it and awful. And that's a lifetime, right? Now you might have to take care of a child that you did not want for the rest of your life in that sense. But the courts tend to not get involved in that. There could be maybe a civil lawsuit, something could come into play, but not a criminal law. Because the criminal law is very different, because it's taking away our freedoms. You know, it's taking that away. And it's based on something where you really intended to harm. And then we're also not criminalizing like other serious diseases. So a good example that I think folks can kind of like, oh, that's interesting. HPV, human papillomavirus, which is responsible, associated with cervical cancer. More women die from HPV associated cervical cancer every year in the United States than people living with HIV die from HIV related complications. Yet we're not creating criminal laws that force people with HPV to disclose their HPV status to a sex partner. You know, and again, these are consensual. We're not talking about rape. We're not talking about sexual assault. These are two adults getting together, deciding to have sex, and using drugs. That's only criminalized in about 6 states. The sharing syringes, Indiana is one of them, but most of the states don't have the disclosure piece for sharing syringes, which is also kind of interesting. You have to ask, why? Why didn't that law appear in all the other states? People inject drugs in every state, and HIV is prevalent in every state among people who inject drugs, but it didn't emerge in other states there. But yeah, so it's challenging. And the other thing we find with disclosure is that people are like, well, I would like my partner to tell me if they're living with any kind of serious condition, sexually transmitted disease. Shouldn't they tell me? And our response is, you know, everyone has their own moral thoughts on what their partner should or should not say under different circumstances. And you might have your own personal that, well, I always disclose my HIV status. I couldn't think otherwise, where the person next to me might say, well, you know, I have a hard time sometimes, or I feel they don't need to know. I'm undetectable. Why should I have to tell them? I can't even pass on HIV. But where we're focusing on is not people's own individual moral decisions around these like disclosure. We're saying the criminal law has no place in this. No place in what consensual adults are doing between each other, that it has no place to compel and put any particular burden on the person living with HIV as if somehow they're responsible for protecting the relationship, because everyone has their own responsibility to think about their own health and well-being. But it's challenging because a lot of times you think it's like, oh, I'd want my partner, you know, if they had, you know, any kind of serious sexually transmitted disease, and, you know, it'd be nice for them to tell me, yeah, herpes is not curable, you know, and that can cause complications in certain circumstances, you know, and not everybody discloses to their partner that they have herpes, and then somebody gets it and they're like, oh shit, you didn't tell me, man. Why didn't you tell me you had it? Now I got to go and take this medicine, and I got these cold sores and that sort of thing. But you don't have the criminal law coming in and compelling people because they're adults. And we also know from history that the law does a horrible job regulating sexual behavior. It just doesn't work. So.
Thank you again.
Any other questions?
I'm not seeing any other questions from anybody. I do have to say thank you so much. That was extremely informative. Sadly, I felt a little naive to some of these things before your presentation. But yes, thank you so much for this.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you all for coming. And if there's no more questions, I guess everyone can go eat dinner. Any other questions? No? Go ahead, Cole.
Hi, Carrie. I was just going to add on. I had a thought. of what the guy said about if A, B, and C happens and it being a felony or misdemeanor. But I mean, it's just a good example of why the laws need to be brought up to date, this modernization movement, because the CDC science, everything is proved that A, B, and C is a very rare case. Like the transmission is, the science proves that these laws need to be updated. Is that correct?
Yeah, because the science is there. The problem we run into is not everybody accepts the science. And so that's it began it. And to add on to that layer, because stigma persists, the stigma is like a blinder, that they still, because of the stigma of HIV, even when you talk about the science, the stigma overrides that of, well, but still, they must be doing some kind of harm, intentionally, trying to hurt somebody with their HIV. And so that's where, like, overall, the stigma, just battling stigma overall, independent of the criminal law, is also important, because the general public, and our legislators especially, carry an incredible amount of stigmatizing attitudes towards people with HIV. And it's very hard to break through, but with education and talking to them and people, sharing, hey, I'm a person living with HIV, look at me, I'm doing well, I'm not, dying tomorrow. And a lot of people don't know that. I mean, I've had people, like, when I disclosed my status, and they're like, 1988, did you say that right? And I said, yes. And they're like, how are you alive? I said, well, I'll tell you a story. Medicines came out, I took them, but they just don't know. They don't know. And part of that also has to do with stigma. As people get diagnosed, they don't want to share. They're afraid they're going to be rejected, and they get very isolated. And we don't see it. It's changing. There's much more education now, much more attention, particularly with the U=U movement. I mean, that has started to really revolutionize just getting out there, the general public. And, people are starting, oh, wait a minute, I've heard that slogan, U=U. Yeah, that means, that those people with HIV can't pass it on. So, but it's tough because, it just takes a lot of patience, a lot of education, and just persistence in trying to change these laws. And we need support. So I welcome everyone, if you're not on my listserv, to join my listserv and follow our work, and call your representatives and your senators, educate them.
Any more questions?
All right, well, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And
Appreciate all the questions, everyone who came out, and hopefully you learned something.
Hey, Carrie, quick question about the U=U. When was the U=U established, like scientifically proven? And when did the movement like catch fire like it is now?
Well, 2008 was when the first studies came out, and the Swiss in Switzerland made a declaration that basically if you were undetectable, and it was predominantly among heterosexuals, that they had the research to actually claim that you could have condomless sex and not worry about passing it on. And they made that statement because a lot of people wanted to have children, right? We were living longer. Even me as an example, when I was first diagnosed, I just wrote off children. Like, no, I guess it's not an option, because I wasn't willing to take a risk of bringing an HIV positive child into the world. And then I thought I'd be dead and leave the child an orphan, right? Bring them. And then though, as time went on and we knew we could prevent mother to child transmission, but then there was the whole thing, once the medicines came out, we were living longer and we knew we could prevent mother to child transmission, there was still the fear that we could pass on HIV to our partners and just have condomless sex. And so then people were seeking like expensive in vitro fertilization, sperm washing, all kinds of different things there, which is also often out of the means of people to pay for. So the Swiss finally realized you can just have sex if you want to have a child, just get undetectable. So that was as far back as 2008. And then the later studies came out a few years later that were the partner study. And then there was a study in Australia that came out that showed sex between men who have sex with men, that if you were undetectable and you couldn't pass it on. So the movement took off in 2016. Summer of 2016, basically all the scientists who published on that and the advocates, and it started with people living with HIV. And it was one of those things that scientists publish and they don't have a publisher, right? Like I'm a scientist, right? I write articles, but no one is out there advertising, look what Dr. Foote found in her article. No, we don't have publicists. We just put it in a journal. So the science wasn't really getting out there, but people who knew, CDC knew, they knew all this science. And then some other people knew, and they felt we weren't capable of handling this information. Like, oh, if we tell people with HIV that they, treatment is prevention, they're all going to be reckless and they're all going to throw the condoms away. And then we're going to have this huge STI outbreak and we're all going to catch STDs because we're not using condoms, and that we wouldn't be able to be responsible with that information. And basically, we have a right to know that. Anything that affects our life, we have a right to know that science because we're living in fear of passing this on. And so that's where the advocates kind of went, that these scientists, the CDC, they should be publishing this on their website, getting this out. It should be shared in the doctor's office, and doctors should be telling their patients because people are living in stigma and fear of passing on HIV when they can't pass on HIV. And it's unethical of them not to tell us that. So it really took off. It started in 2016. I would say, I think it was around 2017, a whole year later, when it really, like, Anthony Fauci started to say it, CDC started to update their stuff. But if it wasn't for the advocates advocating on doing that, then you wonder how many more years would it have taken before they shared the science with us, that basically, treatment is prevention, which is pretty incredible. Really.
Yeah, thank you for that. Because since my time living with HIV, since 2015, I didn't hear about U equals U for the first couple of years. And you passed me, hold on, this shirt. And then it like changed my whole freaking life because I became more educated, and I had a child, and but it's only caught fire in the last couple years.
Yeah.
Which I knew. Thank you for that education about the Swiss. I knew that it had been had been documented and studied for quite some time. I didn't know it was 2008 in the Swiss. So yes, thank you again.
And if you think about that, 2008, 2016, and now the research at that time was only for men and women, not for men who have sex with men. But still, if you think about, because if you look globally, like sub-Saharan Africa is predominantly heterosexual transmission of HIV. All these people living in fear. All these people like, well, I can't just have condomless sex because I could pass HIV on to my partner. And I don't want to give, I'd feel awful if that happened. And there's no reason for that, and then, people want to make decisions for us. They don't trust us.
This is kind of, it's on the same sense, but also breastfeeding, right?
Yeah, so breastfeeding is interesting right now because that's going on right now with the U equals U, and I don't know enough about it. How it works, but there's something about breastfeeding that there's a very small chance that even if you're undetectable, you could still pass on HIV by breastfeeding. And again, I don't have the knowledge to really share correctly, but it has something to do when you're lactating and you're breastfeeding. The reason you breastfeed is you're giving your immune system to the baby so that they're stronger and they build a strong immune system and they get these nutrients that they may not get if you didn't breastfeed. So there's a lot of HIV receptive cells because of the immune system. And then certain medications don't penetrate as well with the breast tissue, the milk ducts, and all that sort of thing. So there's still it does get in there, the HIV medications, it does suppress it, but there's still a tiny chance. But right now there's a whole movement going on called Milky Mamas. And the milky mamas are advocating that mothers have a right to make those decisions themselves, that the risk is so low that they have a right, if they decide to breastfeed, when that very low risk of contact, that they shouldn't be judged, they shouldn't experience shame, and they shouldn't be stigmatized. So it's a whole, just starting in the past like year, 2 years, of women saying it's so incredibly low, and the benefits of breastfeeding are so incredibly high that they want support from their providers when they make that decision. They don't want their providers to judge them and to stigmatize them and then send them out of the office and then they never come back. They want to be able to walk in and say, look, I want to, I understand the risk. It's incredibly low. And I want to do everything I can to prevent that. They love their children. They don't want their children to get HIV. And it's pretty interesting just to see, because it is incredibly low. And that's also stigma too, like how low is low before it's okay for people to make decisions. HIV is not a death sentence the way it was in the 80s. It's a very manageable condition. So when it's like less than 1% and you're stigmatizing a whole group population for making that decision, is very harmful.
Well, there's another factor involved there too. First of all, you can further mitigate the risk because the newborn, an theoretically exposed newborn, is treated with antiretrovirals initially. And there are pediatricians who would agree to continue that treatment, that prophylaxis, beyond the initial period, if the mother wants to breastfeed. Mm-hmm. The other side of that is, though, that potentially it could result in criminal charges, or at least there's a fear among some women that either their child would be taken away, or so this needs to be further worked out before it becomes routine.
The other thing too, you made me think of something. In our model law, our modernization law, Lambda Legal had put a clause in there for the that this intentional disease transmission law, that pregnant women would be excluded because they feared people would use it in precisely that way, that if a woman got pregnant and she was living with HIV, whether she decided to carry that pregnancy, decided to breastfeed, that she could be accused of intentionally trying to pass on HIV to her child under that law. So they have an exclusion in the law that it doesn't apply. So these are like categories of people that the law wouldn't apply to, because that kind of thing has happened where women have been charged and criminalized, giving birth to a baby that's HIV positive, and then suddenly they face jail time, for doing that. And, the bottom line is criminalization is never a solution to a public health problem, ever. It just isn't. These are public health problems, and public health approaches are going to be more effective on epidemics of any kind, and, just to kind of pick on COVID, COVID's very serious and kill people. And we watch as the advocates, hoping that no legislation gets introduced to criminalize, people who may not want to get the vaccine, people who, sneeze on somebody while having COVID, and then suddenly they're charged with a crime. That's not going to help the COVID epidemic at all. And at one point, some of you might remember our governor. He with COVID wanted to make it a misdemeanor crime if you weren't like following the mask mandate. There was something he passed early on, and he used his executive orders as governor, and all the police said, you can't do that. That's not a law. Where if someone comes to us and says that person's not wearing a mask, arrest them, they're going to call the local health department. And I thought, well, that's exactly what you need to do. Can you do that for people with HIV too? Don't call the cops, call the health department. So it's just interesting. But pregnant women, it's another very vulnerable population, because women are vulnerable to begin with. And then when they're HIV positive and pregnant, it's a whole nother thing. Well, how'd you get pregnant? Why'd you do that? You're HIV positive, and you have to have another conversation. It's okay to get pregnant. It's okay to have children, and to be supported around that. But because of misinformation and stigma, it's unfortunate. We're 40 years into the epidemic, and we still have to do so much educating around the disease.
Okay, we are at 7:30, so I'm gonna be respectful of everybody's time, but Cole does have a hand raised, so let's just take this as the last question before we wrap up.
I'm sorry, that must still be from last time. Thank you anyway.
Okay. Well, then
Right.
let's just wrap up and thank again Dr. Carrie Foote for all of this information. Very beneficial. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Have a good night, everybody.